Good morning and welcome to session 8. So, we are still in what we talked about last week as the Deuteronomistic history. And so, just to review what that means, we are in a series of biblical books that reflects a school of thought, so a theological tradition within ancient Israel that is one of the schools of thought present in the Old Testament. Another school of thought that deals with historical books can be found in the Chronicles and then Ezra and Nehemiah. That those books come later and they're reflecting back on some of these same events with a different theological interpretation. And we don't read them in this course, but if you go and read them after, you'll notice they're talking about the same events. They speak of many of the same details, but their interpretation of what those mean theologically can sometimes be very different. So the books that we are reading do have a very particular theology that the Hebrew people have preserved as one of the theological reflections in the Old Testament. These books were written over several hundred years between the 8th and the 6th centuries BC. The majority of what we have written down was probably written during the 7th century BC during the reign of King Josiah. So the bulk of this was written during the reign in Judah of a descendant of David who is remembered as ruling as a devout king, and we'll get snippets of his reign later on, but this was a time of relative prosperity that a lot of this stuff is getting written down. And then this is going to be continue to be added to. You know, the Deuteronomistic history does extend past his reign, so people are still writing after he dies, and it takes its final form, as do most of the books that are currently in our Old Testament, during and just after the Babylonian exile around 539 BC. So again, this school of thought takes up a massive amount of time, and so we have a very consistent tradition. It's anachronistic, but to help us get our minds around what I mean, this could be a proto-denomination, right, within. Kind of like how in the first century you have proto-denominations of Pharisees and Sadducees and Essenes. These theological schools of thought, and again, it's anachronistic. They're not organized groups like churches, but it's a tradition within the larger religion of ancient Judaism. So these writers, again, they are giving a theological interpretation of the events that they are telling. And their theological kind of point they're trying to hammer home is really best exemplified in Samuel's goodbye speech in 1 Samuel 12:14 and following. And this was the theme verse for this week is out of this speech. But hear these. If you will fear the Lord and serve him and heed his voice and not rebel against the commandment of the Lord, and if both you and the king who reigns over you will follow the Lord your God, it will be well. But if you will not heed the voice of the Lord, but rebel against the commandment of the Lord, then the hand of the Lord will be against you and your king. Only fear the Lord and serve him faithfully with all your heart, for consider what great things he has done for you. But if you still do wickedly, you will be swept away, both you and your king. So this makes a lot of sense why this is one of the theological traditions present, because if you think about what's coming down the line, right? So after the events that we're going to talk about today, when the kingdom split in two, eventually the north kingdom is going to get conquered by Assyria. Eventually the southern kingdom is going to get conquered by Babylon. And as they're looking backward at these events, they're trying to make sense out of them. Why did God allow this to happen? Their answer is because they were unfaithful and God allowed the other groups in this region to come and conquer them. Now, this is not the only view present in the Old Testament, right? Think about the theological tradition present in the book of Job. Job is very clear that you cannot correlate bad things in this life with the righteousness of the person they're happening to, right? Job doesn't pull any punches to say, you can be literally perfect and bad things are still going to happen to you. Jesus drives this home even more, right? Who sinned that this person was born blind? Nobody sinned. Jesus was perfect. His life did not turn out well. I mean, it does ultimately, right? Because of God intervening supernaturally. But the ways of the world take their toll on Jesus, right? So certainly, this is not the only theological perspective in the Bible, but it is the theological tradition that these authors are holding to. Do you follow me? Okay. So the other part about this review is that this group of stories that are in the Deuteronomistic history are a compilation from sources. So this is why the writers of these are called historians and not prophets, right? Because they're not writing oracles from God. They are compiling sources and editing them together. This is why we have those references in what you read this week to the Acts of Solomon the king or the Annals of the kings of Judah, right? There are these other sources that they are drawing from and retelling their stories and interpreting them. And so as you were reading the readings this week, if you notice that these stories have some sudden shifts in tone about how the kings are portrayed, right? Especially Saul. Sometimes Saul is this great, upstanding person, and other time he's a no good, dirty, rotten scoundrel, right? Seemingly without a clear differentiation between the two. Again, it's because these historians are taking sources and bringing them together. Each of those sources also has their own view about what's going on. But what they share is the underlying theological argument. So the reason this historian is including them in the book is that even if they have a different opinion of what a king is doing at that moment, and even if they disagree on some details, the underlying theological argument remains consistent. If you do what God tells you, good things happen. If you don't do what God tells you, wrath happens. Okay? Now, different legends and stories, sometimes as they're preserved, they have kind of differences that are easy to reconcile. So one of these is like, how did Saul get chosen to be king? Right? So in one story, in 1 Samuel 9, God comes down to Samuel and tells him directly, Saul is the one that I want. But then in the very next chapter, in 1 Samuel 10, verse 17 and following, he gets chosen by lot, right? Which means that they either rolled dice or pulled straws. It was some kind of game of chance that they saw as the way to discern God's will. Now, that one's one of the easy ones, right? Both of those could have happened, right? Back to back. There's not an impossibility that both of those things occurred. Others are less easy to reconcile. So the stories of how David came to be in Saul's court, right? So the first one, he is playing music to soothe the afflicted king in 1 Samuel 16, right? And Saul gets to know him and brings him in. But then in 1 Samuel 17, we get the story that he slays Goliath, and then Saul has to ask, whose is this? Right? Whose son is this? Who is this boy? Right? Now, if those two things both happened, either Saul has a terrible memory of the person that is supposed to be living with him week after week and doesn't know his name, or these are two different stories brought together, right? But again, the author doesn't try to reconcile them into one account. He keeps those details in because it's important that we know as readers that these are two different accounts, but by the time this is getting written down, it's impossible to know exactly which one happened in which way, so he just includes them both. Another one of these happens with the question, who killed Goliath? Right, you're saying, what do you mean? I know the story. David takes the stones, he flings them, and then chops off his head, right? Well, that's the story in 1 Samuel 17. But then later on, in 2 Samuel 21, verse 19, it says that the person who killed Goliath was Elhanan, the son of Oregon. Okay, so if you look at 2 Samuel 21, verse 19, it says that Goliath was killed by a completely different guy. Right? Those are the details that are less easy to just say, oh, these both could have happened. It's like, well, no, if David killed Goliath, David killed Goliath. If Elhanan killed Goliath, then Elhanan killed Goliath. Right? So there are these different historical accounts that end up being included. But what's important is the biblical writers including these conflicting accounts back to back in the minds of the people reading this is always going to be subordinated to the theological point that they are trying to make. Never let conflicting details get in the way of a good religious argument. Okay, so it's just one of the other reasons that when we read Scripture, we are always reading a religious text. It deals with history, it touches on history, it is derived from history, but it is always a religious argument that the Hebrew people and the church have put our stamp on to say, this tells us something about God, right? Or if you want to use kind of inspiration language, these words God chose to be included, and through his sovereignty and providence have made sure that we are reading, not because of the details, but because they tell us something about who God is. You follow? Okay, let's turn to the narrative itself. So our first stories talk about Samuel. And we talk about Samuel usually as a prophet. Yes, he was a prophet, but importantly, Samuel was the last of the judges, right? Samuel is not just a purely religious figure. We see that Samuel also had those military responsibilities. Samuel was also trying cases. In 1 Samuel 7, we're reminded also that judges primarily were local actors, right? They are local prophets, they are seers, right? They are able to tell you something about what God has in store for you. And we learn that Samuel's primary territory was a circuit year by year to Bethel, Gilgal, and Mizpah, and he judged Israel in all these places. Then he would come back to Ramah, for his home was there. And if you have a study Bible and you look at a map where those cities are, it's not all over Israel, right? They are a cluster in one geographic area. So judges primarily were local, and especially when they were doing their duties as magistrates and administrative officials, their circuit court was a local area. They come to prominence when God uses them to collect in a military force from across Israel and lead them against the enemies. But remember, whenever we talk about the judges, they have national fame and national implications, but primarily they stay in one area. And that's an important difference to make sure that we keep separate in our mind the office of the judge versus the office of the king, right? A huge difference between the judge and the king was explicitly national, right? A source of unity for all the tribes. The judges were only able to do that in very kind of specific instances, and it was not a regular occurrence that the judge would be administering the entire nation. So Samuel is a prophet. Samuel speaks for God. Samuel's predictions come true, and Samuel is able to defend Israel against the Philistines while he is in this office. His primary tasks as a transitional figure is to anoint the monarchy, right? And this is a pattern that kind of remains true kind of throughout the kings of Israel and even into the European monarchies after their conversion, right? The monarchy in Judean and Christian traditions is a religious office. Monarchy is a religious office, right? They are anointed by the priests and the prophets, right? When we see that in Europe, it's the Pope or the bishop that they are working with that anoints a monarch. Even today in the English monarchy, it's the Archbishop of Canterbury who anoints the kings and queens of England. That's why if you go and watch the series The Crown, when Elizabeth is crowned, the hymn that is playing in the background is Zadok the priest and Nathan the prophet anointed Solomon king, and all the people rejoiced. Right? They are drawing us into this reality of the king and queen serving a divine role, not as divine, but a called religious office. Now, later on in history, this turns into power struggles between the religious establishment and the secular political establishment, because the king is the king of the priests and the prophets and the bishops too, but the priests and the prophets and the bishops anoint the king. So you see how there's a built-in tension there. And that's like the English Reformation was all about resolving that tension, right? The Catholics wanted to be very clear, Pope, king. The English monarchs, Henry VIII, wanted to be very clear. The Pope could have his jurisdiction in Rome, but in England, king, bishops. Okay, so all of that tension begins here. Okay, so let's talk about Saul. Saul's that first king. If you haven't heard my sermon from Sunday, I kind of do a speed run through the moral states of Saul, David, and Solomon. So if you haven't seen my sermon, go back online and watch that, because I'm not going to cover the same material here. Saul is primarily a tragic figure. We see that in the first few chapters where he's introduced in 1 Samuel, they're extremely positive about the person that Saul is and about the qualities of his reign, right? So Saul is even shown to be, ecstatic in prophecy along with the prophets, right? There's no question that, Saul was not empowered by God to be a king, right? He is showing all the signs, including himself becoming prophetic, right? And we see kind of later on, we ascribe this to David and Solomon too, right? In our tradition, David's Psalms become scripture. The Song of Solomon, though, was it written by Solomon? Were the Psalms written by David? Probably. Was the Song of Solomon written by Solomon? Maybe. It's not actually ascribed to him in the work the same way tradition says that he wrote that, not the work itself. So, but the Psalms of David say a Psalm of David, right? But still, in the tradition, both David and Solomon are shown to be inspired, right? Their writings become scripture. And so, again, the role of the king is very close to the role of the prophet. even though there are still just prophets that end up being kind of the accountability for the king, right? So complex socio-religious environments. The final product of the words that we get about Saul, right, remember, are mostly constructed and edited under the Davidic dynasty. So just thinking about the way that Saul ends up being portrayed, remember that the final people that are saying the words about Saul are living in Davidic Judah. So there is a sharp turn in the narrative when there's a moment that we get Saul losing divine favor, and then it is just unambiguously negative after that, right? In a way that is not true with David, right? When David sins, things go downhill, but it is not unambiguously negative as to David's character, right? But again, they are living and writing under a king who's descended from David, not a king who's descended from Saul. So when these authors look at Saul, as soon as he takes the turn, they don't have a positive thing to say, right? And it's not to say that David didn't do good things after he sinned and repented, or that Saul, I have no doubt that Saul did bad things continuously, right? But again, think about the authors and their situations. Saul, it probably comes out worse than his actual reign was. Because remember, the people didn't try to overthrow him. He was still winning battles. He was still protecting God's people. He never abandoned the worship of Yahweh. And David probably comes out even a little bit better than he should, even though we kind of continually get a downward trend for David too. So just keep in mind when you're reading this, the authors have perspective. It doesn't change the underlying theological point, but the authors have perspective. Okay. So let's turn to David. Oh, sorry. Saul is ultimately rejected by God, and the reason that he is rejected is trying to keep the spoils of war. And then we have the narrative tell us that the Spirit of the Lord departs from Saul, and an evil spirit from the Lord is sent. Now, this is a super uncomfortable and a very strange turn of phrase. Today's theology, right, which has been corrected by Christ, would say that God would never do something evil, right? An evil spirit from God doesn't make any sense, right? Because God is just good. Evil, by definition, is rejecting God, right? And that's something that Christ makes very clear. The writers of these books, they haven't come to that conclusion yet, right? There is God, right? And God is merciful, God is just, but have they come to the conclusion yet that God can't do evil? Apparently not. Okay, so just keep in mind, our understanding of God grows and is perfected by Christ. There's a lot of stuff that Christ has to go back to people and say, I know the way that you've been reading this, but I need to correct you. Okay, this is probably one of those places. Because today, if we talked about an evil spirit from God, we would say that's a misunderstanding of who God is. So what is meant here by an evil spirit from God? Really, we don't know. Clearly, it is some kind of emotional and mental distress, discomfort, right? So if you talk about the Spirit of the Lord bringing peace, this is the opposite of whatever that is. In modern language, it's tempting to talk about this as some kind of mental illness. But at the same time, because of the way that concepts don't translate between, 3,000 years ago and today, we want to be really careful. This is seen kind of unambiguously as supernatural in origin, right? So this is not a disease. This is not something that can be cured the same way that we know today that with a certain kind of regimen of medication and therapy and lifestyle changes, mental illness can be managed and ameliorated. That's not the case here, right? The only person that seems to be able to do anything about this evil spirit from God is David, who has been anointed by God as a supernatural agent. Okay? By the time we get to the New Testament, evil spirits are unambiguously personal agents, right? Jesus can hold a conversation with a demon, right? It's not just like general malaise. So in the New Testament, when you talk about someone being possessed, there is a much lower chance that we're going to mistake that for a mental illness, right? A demon is a personal demon, right? They have a will, they talk, they act. Jesus can cast them out. They are a person, okay? But with this, because we're so far back, there is some sense, it's not personal, right? Saul's not possessed, but it's also not natural, right? It's not depression. It's not, schizophrenia or epilepsy or the things that happen with the chemicals or the physical structures of our brain. The closest thing that we could say is he's been cursed, right? As he was anointed, God blessed him, and now he has been cursed. So that's probably the tightest comparison that we can make about what's going on here. Okay, David has a really interesting relationship with Saul's family, right? So in the story, several members of Saul's family, after he's rejected by God and starts on his downward spiral, end up siding with David, right? David marries Saul's daughter, Michal. This probably actually serves historically to legitimate his rule, right? He's not an upstart king that comes out of nowhere, right? He's the king's son-in-law. He has as valid a claim to the throne as anyone who isn't Saul's direct heir. And you'll notice if you were reading kind of the stuff about succession, David is established a king in the south first when he is very popular. Saul's other son starts to reign in the north but is eventually killed, and then those tribes fall under David, right? So David's eventual reign, kind of in the theological sense, is established early, because as soon as Saul's rejected, Samuel goes and anoints David and prophesies, "You will be king." That works out kind of sociopolitically by a complex series of schisms and wars and assassinations, and is aided along by the fact that David is Saul's son-in-law and has a claim to the throne, right? If you think about English history, William and Mary come back to depose Mary's father from the throne, right? So not unheard of in modern times that the eventual king of a land is the son-in-law of a king and his daughter, right? That's happened again, within the last 3,000 years. So similar thing happening here. The second really interesting relationship is David and Jonathan, right? So just cards on the table. The way that David and Jonathan's relationship is described is using almost explicit marital language, right? This has given rise to a whole lot of homoerotic speculation between the relationship of David and Jonathan, right? Obviously, they were not married, that did not exist. But what was the nature of their relationship? Lot of speculation. Mostly from verses like these, 1 Samuel 18, the soul of Jonathan was bound to the soul of David, and Jonathan loved him as his own soul. Saul took him that day and would not let him return to his father's house. Then Jonathan made a covenant with David because he loved him as his own soul. Right? Like, I love my friends. But do I leave my father's house and make a covenant with them because I love them as my own soul? That's kind of a whole other level of relationship. And then you get a verse when David is mourning Jonathan in 2 Samuel 1. Jonathan lies slain upon your high places. I am distressed for you, my brother Jonathan. Greatly beloved were you to me. Your love to me was wonderful, surpassing the love of women. So, the relationship of David and Jonathan, lot of speculation. So, as we kind of are coming into the modern era, obviously the idea of sexual orientation is a very modern development. The idea that you are kind of, your will or your biology is directed more to one or the other, and then kind of all the complicated stuff in between. In the ancient world, there wasn't a concept of orientation. So the idea that you would be attracted to men, women, both, anything in between, would not have been controversial. It would have been expected that you, in modern language, were pansexual. The idea of being gay or straight is incredibly recent historically. The assumption in the ancient world was that everyone is attracted to everyone. So, kind of puts a new light on these verses with David and Jonathan, a relationship, just mind you, that is nowhere condemned, right? Their relationship, whatever it was, is lauded as an example of whatever it was. Okay, David's reign is marked by a lot of wars, right? David is trying to fend off an enemy invasion all the time. One of the most significant things about David's reign is the capture of Jerusalem. Because remember, Jerusalem up until this point had not been Israelite territory. One of the important and probably strategic political moves he makes is to move the capital there, because no tribe had a foothold there. The residents of Jerusalem were primarily not Israelites. So as he captures that city, it really does become the city of David, right? That's not a metaphor. It was, he took it, he ruled it. The people saw him as their leader, not the tribal allegiance. And then he very literally brought Yahweh to him, right? So Yahweh was established kind of at the shrines all over the place. The ark had been fairly stable after it had been returned by the Philistines. David brings it to the capital, which means that Jerusalem and David's administration gets a vice grip on both the political and the religious life of Israel. David's reign ultimately collapses theologically because of the consequences of his affair with Bathsheba, right? God says the sword will never depart from your house, and then everything falls apart. So he ends up losing control over his sons. So one of his sons ends up raping his half-sister. The other son goes to war against him out of kind of making sure the honor is restored and revenge. And his whole house falls apart, right? David ends his reign first literally impotent and politically impotent, right? So he's unable to affect anything. He becomes a pawn in this Game of Thrones between his sons and Bathsheba and the priests and the prophets, right? He's just in bed. They're doing all the scheming around him. So again, he doesn't have as tragic an end as Saul does, but it's by no means a happy ending for David. Then we get to Solomon. Solomon is a rich and powerful king. He has a legend as being supernaturally wise, and we see that being, the historian is putting that on a blessing directly from God, right? He asks God for wisdom. God answers that blessing. And for as much wisdom as he actually has an extremely large harem, right, of wives and concubines as well. And again, that shows status. Those are also political alliances, right? He marries Pharaoh's daughter, so he becomes the son-in-law of the king of Egypt, and princesses, it's very explicit, from lots of other nations. These forge political agreements. That's key to understanding this eventual downfall, because he turns to polytheism. The scriptures really want us to think that it was for the love of his wives, right? And to some extent, I'm sure that's true. He loved the fact that they were his wives, right? Because it secured his political alliances. But he's not shown to be like a wedding present to set up an Asherah pole, right? He made all of these alliances and loved, right, both carnally and politically, these women. He wanted to make them happy because their happiness meant that their home nation would be happy in their relation to Israel. This was an explicitly political move to allow polytheism and paganism back into Israel. And just a note, Solomon's polygamy is certainly prudentially unwise, right? It shows you the way that he is using this institution of marriage towards political ends, and he is going about it poorly. Interestingly, the Bible never explicitly condemns polygamy in theory, right? By the time we get into the New Testament in the Roman era, Rome frowned on it. And Rome frowned on it because they wanted the family to be kind of the center of life, and they wanted a clear succession for legal reasons. So Christians end up picking that up for theological reasons, mostly to do with wanting human relationships to model the marriage of Christ in his church one-to-one. But in the Old Testament, polygamy is seen as regular, as a perfectly valid way to be married. So if you want to talk about biblical marriage, you're nowhere going to find clear monogamy, right? Throughout the Old Testament, the picture is much more complicated. Okay, so what are the takeaways? The takeaway is the same as what I started with, this main point of the Deuteronomistic history. Good leadership goes hand in hand with faithfulness. And faithfulness is the ultimate decider of whether a king is seen as good or bad in the eyes of the scriptures. And their success in their reign is shown to be God helping them because of their faithfulness. Kingly faithfulness specifically, right? We saw it in Egypt that the Pharaoh's opposition to God brought consequences on all the Egyptians. Now that Israel has a king, this same dynamic is present, right? When a judge was disobedient, bad things happened to that judge. When a king is disobedient, he brings the entire nation down with him. Okay, we're going to break out into groups. God bless.